Hey everyone, it's Roshan here. I'm the University Program Assistant Director at MouseBelt, and I have here with me Colton from Stellar. Welcome to the Stellar workshop. Colton is going to be doing an introduction to Stellar today. Colton, you can take it away, and I'm excited to have you as a part of this event. And thank you so much for doing a workshop for us today.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the introduction. Like you mentioned, my name is Colton. I work for the Stellar Development Foundation. We are a nonprofit organization that was founded in 2014. Our sort of core responsibilities are to maintain the Stellar code base, support the Stellar ecosystem, and drive adoption and education for the Stellar network through things like this. But ultimately, that's all with the goal of making Stellar the sort of new payment standard. Before we dive into it, I wanted to kind of give a brief overview of what the entirety of the ecosystem looks like. You can kind of break it down into these three pillars. So at the very bottom, we have our sort of infrastructure layer, which is essentially just Stellar Core. And Stellar Core is the open source backend for storing and moving money. This is the Stellar network. And then we have our platform layer, which is the suite of tools and services that are built on top of Stellar, such as the Horizon API or the different types of Stellar SDKs written across various different languages. And then we have our ecosystem layer, which includes things like businesses, our community, the different partnerships that we make within SEF, but also that other organizations building on Stellar make with each other. And then you have various different products that are built on Stellar. So what is Stellar? Stellar is essentially an open network for moving, trading, and storing value. And the reason I say value there instead of something like money or whatever is because many different types of tokens are issued on Stellar, ranging from fiat currencies to other cryptocurrencies to stocks to bonds, game assets, the list goes on. So value kind of just encapsulates all of these different things. And I like to say that Stellar achieves this through a few key features, but obviously key features is relative to me. If you ask somebody else within the ecosystem, they might give you, an entirely different answer. So if you're familiar with the blockchain space, you're familiar with this concept of a distributed ledger, but also Stellar is really great for asset issuance, fast, cheap payments, and it has a native decentralized exchange built into the protocol itself. So the distributed ledger is similar to other chains. It just stores the state of the network. And this includes things like account data, account balances, different order book offers, issued assets, all of that good stuff. Basically anything that alters the state of the network gets stored in the ledger. That ledger gets passed around to the different nodes of validators on the network, and you can fetch that data, change that data, etc. The way that the validators come to consensus about the state of the ledger is through what's called the Stellar Consensus Protocol. And I won't pretend to be an expert on SCP for this workshop, but there are a few properties to be familiar with are one, SCP is very different from something like proof of work or proof of stake. It uses this concept of transitive trust to create overlapping trust between validators who then can come to consensus on the state of the ledger. This allows the consensus protocol to be very efficient. So on Stellar, it has 5-second ledger closes compared to other networks that take much longer. And then the other property that's really important for Stellar is deterministic finality. So if you've ever sent like a Bitcoin transaction, for example, you probably had to wait 30, 40, 50 minutes sometimes to get that transaction confirmed. That's because transactions, once they're sent, aren't necessarily final on Bitcoin or any other proof of work chain. There's always the risk that the network could fork. That doesn't really exist on Stellar. If the nodes on the network can't come to consensus, they simply just halt until they can come to consensus. You can always check out the SCP Whitepaper to get more information on that. The other property I mentioned was asset issuance. So the easiest way to explain this is that there's two different types of assets on Stellar. So you have lumens, which are the native asset of the network. These are used to pay fees and to act as a sort of neutral currency within the network. And then you have assets that are issued by other people. These are very similar to tokens issued in other networks. The big difference in regards to Stellar is that tokens are sort of first-class citizens on the network rather than a byproduct of what's possible on the network. So once you're exploring Stellar, you'll see that there's many different types of assets issued. They all interact with lumens oftentimes in the different markets within the network. You'll also notice that different people hold different types of assets. There's all kinds of different types of asset issuers. And that's because Stellar makes it really easy to issue assets. You can literally do it in probably like 5 to 10 minutes. Another category of asset issuer we have are called anchors. And I said another category, but this is more of just a label. Anybody can be an anchor if they want to. There's no difference between traditional Stellar accounts and accounts that are called anchors or whatever. This is kind of just a nickname. But anchors are typically banks, payment services. It could be maybe somebody who's building a game on Stellar. Anybody who issues an asset and tethers that asset to something in the real world. So this kind of flow of taking user deposits, issuing the equivalent as a token on Stellar, and then redeeming those tokens back into the real world. We just kind of call that an anchor. And so you can see what an account might look like on Stellar. You can see in this account, it holds lumens, of course. Every account has to have lumens, but I also hold 5 USD in this account, a little bit of Bitcoin, and then various different accounts might hold, various other types of currencies that are relevant to their daily life. So the other feature is payments. And while this isn't particularly unique to Stellar in any way, but because Stellar supports so many different assets, you're able to send and receive any asset as a user of the network. You also get the luxury of low fees because the Stellar consensus protocol is so efficient. And so this allows you to sort of easily integrate payment rails into your applications without a whole lot of overhead and making users deal with all kinds of fees and slow transaction times and all that good stuff, or I guess bad stuff. And an example of this is an app we're actually launching from SDF relatively soon called Vega. And essentially people can hold different types of currencies within this wallet, send it to each other, and it kind of abstracts away the complexity of crypto, but still has a feel that's very similar to like Venmo or Cash App or whatever. So it doesn't feel like you're using a traditional crypto wallet when you're actually using it. One of the other important features of Stellar is the Stellar Decentralized Exchange, or the SDEX. So typically, if you've ever interacted with a decentralized exchange somewhere else, it's probably built by some set of developers. Like on Ethereum, for example, there's several different decentralized exchanges. But on Stellar, we have one built natively into the protocol. So this means that you can basically have open order book listing and shared liquidity across the network. So anybody could sort of submit, buy, and sell offers on the network. Anybody has access to low fee trading on the network because interacting with the SDEX basically costs the same amount as sending a payment or anything else. It can also help facilitate what we call path payments, which I'll cover in a second. And ultimately having this sort of decentralized exchange built into the protocol itself allows asset issuers to make their assets accessible to all of the users on the network. And the way that the decentralized exchange is represented varies across the different products in the Stellar ecosystem. For example, we have Stellar X here, which is basically a traditional looking trading interface. So this appeals to more trader type users, whereas you have something like Lobster, which is a crypto wallet that kind of abstracts away all of the complexity of dealing with order books and all that good stuff and just lets you just kind of buy and sell directly into the asset and kind of fetches the best prices for you. But the unique thing here is that these are both dealing with the same assets. They're both dealing with the same order books. It's just the way that they present these order books is very different. Another example is something like DStock, which hasn't launched. They've launched their beta though, where essentially they are issuing tokens or stocks, real world stocks as tokens on the Stellar network. And then they've only chosen to present a version of the SDEX that shows their stocks. So it's all the same SDEX, but again, they've narrowed it down to this very specific use case, which is great because it kind of hides away all of the extra fluff that maybe their users don't want to deal with. And I mentioned earlier this little feature called path payments, and path payments essentially combined the Stellar Decentralized Exchange with the ability to send payments so that users can send payments across different assets. So I mentioned that assets are sort of first-class citizens on Stellar, and it's likely you'll come across many of them as you interact with the network. It's important that you're able to send and receive those assets across each other, and path payments facilitate that. So in the example below here, you can see that somebody's trying to send a Philippine peso, and by the time it gets to person 2, they want it converted to Nigerian naira. And you can see in between, it gets converted to US dollars, and then lumens, and then naira. And basically the way that this works is that the wallet that person 1 is trying to send the naira through first queries with our Horizon API and says, hey, I need a path from the peso to the naira. It'll generate a path across the SDEX, open SDEX orders. And then after finding the best path, the person 1 will click send, and then basically it'll do all the conversions behind the scene. And by the time it gets to person 2, it'll be converted to naira. So you don't have to go through this hassle of like going to an SDEX interface and then selling your currency into another currency and then sending it to your friend. It's kind of, it removes a lot of the overhead of dealing with different assets on the network. And an example of this here is I'm trying to send a lumen to my friend Zach here, but I want to send USD and have it converted to lumens by the time it gets to him. And the quality is a little bad, sorry about that. But you can see within a few seconds, it instantly gets converted from 5 cents USD to lumens by the time it gets to him. It took longer to actually fill in the information than it did to send the payment here. So it's a pretty cool feature. We've seen a lot of different use cases pop up using it. So I'm excited to see people explore this further. Now that we have an overview of the network, I'll give a brief overview of the ecosystem in case anybody decides they, want to build on Stellar. So the first thing I would recommend checking out is our documentation. Over the past several months, we spent a lot of time revamping not only our developer documentation, but our non-developer documentation as well. So we have content for a wide variety and range of people with different skill sets. So no matter what you're into, you'll be able to find content that's sort of relevant to you. But if you're deciding to build on Stellar, you might need to be familiar with the Horizon API and Stellar Core. Not so much Stellar Core, but definitely Horizon API. So as a Stellar developer, you'll be basically just posting to the Horizon API and also fetching information from the Horizon API like all the time. So it's something you'll want to be familiar with, and we have great documentation around that as well. And then we also have various SDKs across different languages such as Python, JavaScript, Java, Go, Scala, a couple others. So you don't have to learn a new language to build on Stellar or anything like that. You can basically build in whatever you're comfortable in. And then 2 other features that most people in the blockchain space are familiar with by now is we have a testnet and we have a mainnet. So the testnet is where you play with fake money, and it's made for testing. And then the mainnet is where you sort of take your app into production and you start dealing with real users, real money. And the ecosystem kind of looks like this. So on the left side here, you can see we have things like asset issuers, wallets, payment providers, and any other application, which then interfaces with the Horizon API, which is hosted. SDF hosts a Horizon API. There's a couple other public Horizon APIs, but you can always spin up your own as well, that we are not relying on somebody else to be your entry point into the network. And then you can see that the Horizon API is the one that actually interfaces with Stellar Core. So you're not doing that directly through your application. Another cool tool that we have for experimenting with Stellar is the Stellar Laboratory. So before you even write a line of code, you can come to the Stellar Laboratory and deal directly with an interface. It's kind of a super light wrapper around all of the functionality of the network. You can create accounts, explore the different Horizon endpoints, build transactions, sign transactions, and you can do this on the test network, public network, custom network if you're running your own private network. So there's all kinds of stuff you can do on this, and I've seen people build some pretty robust demos in just Stellar Laboratory alone. So you can kind of mess with all this stuff before you even write a single line of code, which is great. An example of what it looks like here, as you can see here, I'm just trying to build a transaction, and there's simple input forms. You put all the relevant information, and then you just go through, sign it, submit it. Super easy. Another awesome tool is Stellar Expert. So Stellar Expert is basically a typical ledger or blockchain explorer, but it's also an analytics platform for the network. So if you want to come in here, get different information about all of the assets on the network, get information about the different markets that are available on the Stellar Decentralized Exchange. If you want to get information about circulating lumens or the amount of payments in the last 24 hours, there's all kinds of information you can get here. So if this looks like something you might be interested in, I would definitely check it out. And yeah, so moving on, after we get through all the tools, I highly recommend you explore the different use cases that are possible in Stellar. We've seen a lot of different people combine the features in many unique ways to create different types of experiences for their users. So for example, there's something like Keybase, which isn't even a payments app. It's an encrypted chat application, but you can send payments in it because Stellar makes it so easy to do so. And then there's things like DStock, which I mentioned earlier, which allow people from around the world to trade in US stocks that are issued as tokens on Stellar. But then there's things like Lightmint, which have games, or it's basically a gaming app where the assets in each game are issued on the network. So people are exploring all kinds of different use cases with pretty limited functionality, which is great. And if you're interested in learning more, you can head to stellar.org/learn/intro-to-stellar. This is where our sort of basic content is. So if I talk too fast or something like that throughout this video, you can feel free to head over there and kind of reread most of the stuff I've already introduced. Or if you're a developer and you're ready just to dive in, you can go to developers.stellar.org/docs and check out all of our documentation. This is a set of new docs actually that we just launched not too long ago. So if you're wanting to contribute to those, you can do so as well. And then you can go to awesomestellar.com, which is essentially just this wiki of all the relevant Stellar content over the past like year or two. It includes things like podcasts, videos, blog posts, tools, and resources for anybody in the ecosystem. And then lastly, there's our Stellar socials. So we have our public Keybase team where there's around 14,000 people. There's different channels in there for developers, for SDK maintainers. There's a general chat in there. There's all kinds of different channels to find your sort of crowd within the ecosystem. And then we also just have our Twitter at Stellar.org, where you can kind of keep up with the latest news, not only with SDF, but also with the Stellar network. And then if you need to contact me for whatever reason, you can get a hold of me on Keybase. My username is just Colton, or you can get a hold of me at colton@stellar.org. And that's it.
Thanks, Colton from Stellar, for the introduction to Stellar and showing us how to build as well. Thank you so much for being part of Reimagine 2020. And that was the Stellar workshop.
Sweet.